Module 1B, Structure and Staffing of Safe Space. Safe Space separated from the Chico Housing Action Team in 2018. We're now a nonprofit corporation, and we are approved under Section 501c3 as a tax-exempt organization as well. The Shelter Operations Team operates the shelter and reports to the corporation's Board of Directors. Safe Space is a very complex process. It involves 2 locations, about 25 on-site volunteers each night, off-site support crews. Operations take place between the hours of 5 p.m. and about 8 a.m. each morning. So very complex. The 2 locations are the intake center. At the intake center, guests from the previous night are pre-registered. If there's space available, additional guests may be registered and admitted. All guests go through the property storage process and then are transported to that night shelter. The shelter location changes weekly. This has been described as moving a city. At the shelter, we use mats, cots, and bedding to provide a place for the guests to sleep. Meals are provided either by the host church or by some other group, and only minimal medical support, such as cold medicine, is provided. Safe Space is a 100% volunteer organization. We try to ensure that all volunteers are provided with necessary training or information about what they're doing, that they're safe, and that they won't burn out during the period of shelter operations. Volunteers are divided into the core volunteers and nightly volunteers. Core volunteers are more trained and experienced in safe space operations. They provide leadership to the various operational areas, supervising the nightly volunteers. The assumption is that core volunteers will work throughout the entire season, usually for about 2 shifts each week. Nightly volunteers might be regular volunteers or one-time only. They'll have limited training or experience, and they'll be provided with checklists to help orient them to the necessary functions. They'll work with a core volunteer who will provide immediate training, supervision, and problem solving. The responsibilities of the core team are to be the managers of whatever area that they're working in. So core team volunteers are responsible for operation of the shelter within their area. They must move around physically to observe what's happening with the operation and make sure all operations are going well. This includes both supervision of nightly volunteers and monitoring of guests. One important function is problem solving. Since core volunteers are more experienced, they're able to solve problems that come up. This might involve just answering questions, or it might involve making a decision that the nightly volunteers are unable to make. If the core volunteer is unable to solve the immediate problem, it can be kicked up to another core member if present, or to the shelter operations manager. Core volunteers are responsible for training their nightly volunteer crews. The lead core person should connect with the nightly volunteers upon arrival, determine if they've done this role before, and if they haven't, or if they feel the need, find the appropriate checklist from the binder, go over it with them to be sure to replace it in the appropriate place in the binder. The core person should then work with the nightly volunteers as needed until they feel comfortable in their role. Core volunteers will directly participate in some of the functions, such as property storage, but first they must supervise the nightly volunteers to make sure they're comfortable in their jobs and are doing their jobs effectively. This could be done by direct observation or by asking them how things are going. Make sure that all volunteers are wearing their vests and have either a pre-printed name tag, if available, or a written name tag visible. Finally, core volunteers are responsible for record keeping. This might include making sure that all volunteers sign in and out of the nightly log, recording any significant events in the nightly log, or record that there were no significant events, and filing guest paperwork, individual records, nightly logs, etc. in a secure place. The shelter operations team, called the SHOP team, is responsible for overall operations. The team consists of the 4 shelter operations managers and a new position, the administrative services manager. The team is responsible for problem solving as raised by core volunteers or by other people, making the exclusion or rejection decisions, and serving as a contact point person for the shelter host church, the organizations providing food service, and other outside organizations. One shelter operations manager is on duty each day. This person starts at the intake center, eventually moves over to the shelter, and is on call each night. The previous night's operations manager also does a daily report, and the team discusses issues during the day as needed. The administrative support manager is a new position this year. This person oversees all the administrative support areas. These include the facilities coordinator, who recruits facilities and is a point of contact for them during sheltering, the food coordinator, who recruits churches and community groups to provide dinner, the volunteer coordinator, who schedules available volunteers, the supply coordinator, who determines needed supplies, secures them, and delivers them to the shelter, the laundry coordinator and laundry crew, who are off-sheet volunteers who are responsible for cleaning bed linens and reassembling the packages for them, the bags. And finally, the relocation crew, who moves our city every week from church to church. Scheduling of volunteers is important, and again, one of our goals is preventing burnout of regular volunteers, but still making sure that there are sufficient volunteers available throughout the shelter operations. We want to make sure there are at least 4 trained people available for each core team position. Again, we would like each person to work 2 shifts a week, most weeks. Under normal circumstances, though, no volunteer, core or nightly, should work more than 3 consecutive nights. The exact number of required volunteers will change. That might be based on needs of the facility and the number of expected guests. But volunteers are encouraged to schedule themselves and not show up on unscheduled nights. We don't want to have too many people sitting around, and again, we want to try to avoid the burnout.